Okay,
Chairs there, and the
thank you.
podium is on your side.
All right, I'll hold on to the podium and Flo, thank you.
You want the chair a little closer?
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Okay.
Just in case I think I need to sit down. Well, good morning, everybody. Last June, Flo came home from the last Questers meeting before they broke for the summer and announced to me that, David, I signed you up to be the presenter at the September Questers meeting. My reaction to that was, whoa, no, wait, I can't do that. Remember, I'm kind of blind, and I can't do any kind of research that would be needed for any kind of a talk, and I can't produce notes, and if I could, I wouldn't be able to read them anyway. So forget it. Sorry, you'll just have to cancel. Well, her response to that was, but David, I want you to. So I had to come up with something. So I thought about what kind of a topic could I come up with that was appropriate for a Questers meeting that I knew enough about that I could cobble some sort of a talk together. And the topic I came up with was Siouxland. That's spelled Siouxland. Now, what is it? And where is it? Who lives there? And why does that matter? Now, Siouxland doesn't really officially exist. It's an imaginary place. No capital, no county seat, nothing like that, or defined borders. But if you live there, you probably know it. Where is it? Well, go about 50 miles north of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and go from that point south to about the same distance below Sioux City, Iowa. And the area in between is what we call Siouxland, if you're from that area. So this area encompasses a good chunk of northwest Iowa, the southwest corner of Minnesota, the eastern fringe of South Dakota, and the far northeastern part of Nebraska. Now, back in the 1500s, when white Europeans began to colonize our eastern seaboard, Siouxland was an actual wilderness paradise. Well, for at least 3 months or 3 seasons during the year. There's no getting around it. Winter was a pretty harsh, pretty difficult time. But for most of the year, it was really a kind of neat place. The topography of that land is mainly gently rolling. There's some fairly hilly areas, some kind of flat, but it's mostly gently rolling. And of course, that surface covers some of the most terrific farmland, agricultural land in the entire world. Now, this was the land of the tall grass prairie, blue stem and other related grasses. And so when the wind blew over the prairie, it created an ocean wave-like effect. It must have been spectacular. But it wasn't just green. From late winter through the spring and the summer and the fall into the next winter, there was a profusion of vividly colored wildflowers. So it must have been beautiful. Now, I'm from Lyon County, which is the northwestern corner of Iowa, smack dab in Siouxland. But that was not the original name of the county. It was named after one of those wildflowers. So I'm from what was originally called Buttercup County. Could you imagine being from Buttercup? But anyway, it was renamed to honor Iowan who's a Civil War hero. Now, back in those days, before we intruded into that space, there were lots of game. bison, elk, antelope, jackrabbits, and prairie chickens. A lot of prairie chickens. And so there was plenty of meat. That's not a problem. That was not a problem. And there were a number of edible plants that could be collected. You just had to be able to identify them. So food was not a serious problem for most of the year. And they could pile up and keep dry out meat and stuff like that to get through the winter. The human habitation at the time was pretty sparse. Most of the people were members of that larger Winnebago culture that covered much of the upper Midwest. But they were nomadic, mainly. And so they needed a big space to move around in. But there was a very large and significant Indian settlement on the banks of the Big Sioux River, both on the South Dakota side and the Iowa side. And we gave the name Blood Run to this community. It was a major manufacturing and training center for the indigenous peoples of those days. And the number one expert on Blood Run in the whole country, in the whole world, is Dale Henning, right here, living here at Edgewater. And he gave a great talk several years ago about Blood Run. Now, as the time passed and the white settlers' colonies grew and became our early states, and they began to push westward, of course. And they drove ahead of them those few Indians that were able to survive. And they in turn displaced the indigenous people that were further west. So the original location for the Dakota or Sioux people was in northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, and the adjoining part of Canada. But as the Ojibwe, sometimes called the Chippewa, were pushed into that area, there was bound to be trouble. Now, the intruders were desperate, and they were better armed. And so they, in turn, displaced the Sioux, who ended up mainly in western Minnesota and northwestern Iowa and in the Dakotas, where they established their very famed high plains horse culture. And so they've now become the dominant people for a period of time, and this is why we call this area Siouxland after them. Now, white folks took their time getting to the area. It was not easily accessible at the time. But the first ones that did come came up by boat, pretty much up the Missouri River into the Big Sioux River, which empties into the Missouri at Sioux City. And they explored. A couple small settlements, one that became Sioux City, the other one that became Sioux Falls, were established. But they were very small. They were basically fur trading posts at the time. And there were a few farms in the area, mainly along the Big Sioux River, but not many white people, and the population didn't increase hardly at all. Now, at one time I was able to read an early history of Lyon County, and in that I found that the first known white people to set foot in that county was a small band of hunters and explorers. One morning, they wake up and look out, and to their surprise, there was some pretty good game working their way towards them, probably antelope. And so what they did, of course, is grab their guns and get in firing position. And when the game got close enough, they began to fire away, not realizing that that game was being stalked by an Indian hunting party. Well, the Indians were not pleased to have bullets buzzing by. And so, naturally, a confrontation occurred. Serious violence was avoided, but the white guys decided we better get the heck out of here. there's probably more of these Indians in the area. This is not a safe place to be. But at least one of them wrote down about their escapades, and so that's how we learned about that. But anyway, a few more people began to trickle in, but it was pretty much considered virgin territory well into the 19th century. Now, right after the Civil War, the federal government made it a priority to populate the Wild West, which at that time was pretty much the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. And they did this to encourage settlement. They gave land grants to a number of railroad companies. These land grants weren't very wide, maybe 10 miles to 15 miles, something like that. It varied a little bit from one contract to another, but they were very long. It was on these land grants that these companies built the actual railroads. They were able to sell most of the land. They didn't need most of the land in their grants, and so they sold it at low prices to get the money, the capital they needed to finance the building of the actual railroads. And those railroads, when they pushed into the so-called virgin territory, would build a depot, maybe roughly about every 9 miles or so. Some of those depots had water tanks because those steam engines needed a lot of water back in those days. But they built all these depots out in this wild territory. The idea was, if you build a depot, people will come. And that's exactly what happened. People would come, a little village would spring up around the depot to serve the farmers who had also moved into that area, because now they could get to their farm and ship their goods out. So all of a sudden, we have a vast area of terrific farmland available and accessible that was free for the Homestead Act or very inexpensive. So it acted like a magnet, bringing people in. Now, who came? Back at that time in Europe, there was no country called Germany. No, we had Prussia and Bavaria, Oldenburg, Munzenberg, a number of principalities. But they were going through a consolidation process. And that was leading to a lot of warfare. So young Germans had the incentive of going to America to improve their economic status, but also to avoid military conscription. So a lot of Germans in the mid-19th century came to America, a big surge of German people. And of course they headed to the land of opportunity out to the west. So many Germans came into Iowa, they became the #1 nationality in the state. I don't know if that's still true today, but there are a lot of people with German heritage living in Iowa. And a good many of those people headed on up to the northwest corner of the state into Siouxland. In fact, my hometown is Rock Rapids, Inland County, and in my school class, I had a number of classmates with German names, like Brugman and Oldenburg and Remps, Greasy, Foltz, and among others. So we had quite a few people with Germanic heritage in our community. Now I can tell you a personal story here. Back in 1856, Johannes Dietz, who was a Hessian, decided he would like to move to America. So he took his family with him. They enter America, the United States, to the port of Baltimore and proceed right over to Pennsylvania. And they have a farm, they get a farm going. But during the next couple of years, Johannes keeps hearing about this wonderful place called Iowa, where the land was really good, and there was a lot of it available. So he buys into this hype, and moves his family over to eastern Iowa and gets a farm going near Walcott, which I understand is near Muscatine. Now, he did okay. And back in those days, people had big families, and he and his wife had a big family. But it was interesting that it was the youngest son, Conrad, that takes over the farm. And Conrad is an enterprising guy, gets involved in lots of different other economic activities. I don't know what they were, but he wasn't just a farmer, and became quite a leader in that area. And he financed one of his sons, William, to go up to northwest Iowa. William grew up, met Jesse Hines, another German immigrant, and they went up and got a farm going near Harris, Iowa, which is just west of Spirit Lake. And for a couple of years, they were doing quite well. That was tough, but they were doing quite well. But then one of our periodic depressions come along, and he loses the farm. So he has to pick up his family, and they move further west to Rock Rapids, where his big claim to fame was that he was the very first person to operate a motorized hearse in the county. So that's part of our family mythology. But anyway, their fifth child was a boy named Denver, and Denver's my dad. So this kind of story is replicated over and over and over again in this area, and that's why we have so many Germans up in that area of the country. Now, does anyone know what country sent the largest portion of its population to America?
Maybe Ireland.
Any ideas?
Ireland.
Irish. Yeah, Ireland, because of the potato blight, sent more people, a larger percentage of its population to America than any other country. But second to Ireland is Norway. Why Norway? Well, it was the poorest country in Europe at that time. This is before the days of North Sea oil. So the very poor, very spectacularly beautiful country, but not very much good quality farmland. And so if you didn't live in Oslo or Bergen or Trondheim or someplace like that, you probably eked out an existence farming a hardscrabble farm, or maybe you were a fisherman, and fishing in the Baltic and North Seas was very dangerous. So there was a huge incentive to get out of there. A number of other Scandinavians came over during this time, but especially the Norwegians because of their poverty. And they come on over, and they head mainly, again, to this area of opportunity, more to the north than the Germans, but there's a big overlap. But a lot of these Scandinavians, particularly the Norwegians, went to western Wisconsin, Minnesota, the northern tier of Iowa counties. We have Decorah, a Norwegian town in the east. We have Lake Mills, another one in north central Iowa. In fact, there were a number of Norwegian-dominated communities along the Iowa-Minnesota border. And then, of course, a lot of the Norwegians went into the Dakotas, both the north and the south, and they become the number one nationality in those two states. So again, going to my town, we had a lot of Norwegians. And I had classmates with names like Olsen and Harmsen and Ling and Sater and Rolvog, among others. Again, I have a personal story. My maternal grandfather was Eric Johnson. Eric Johnson grew up in the far north of Norway, up near Trondheim, near Murmansk, Russia, actually pretty near the Arctic Circle. So that was a tough place. So I can understand why Eric made the decision to come to America. Now his job was to go over to the United States get employment, make money, and finance the emigration of siblings. And he was somewhat successful. He brought his sister Mary over and his brother John. I grew up in the house that Eric built, and we had a storeroom on our second floor, and we always called it John's room. I never met the guy. He was long gone before I came along. But we called it John's room, so I guess that's where he lived when he was with Eric and his family. Now getting back to Eric, he heads to southwestern Minnesota to a community that was populated by a number of people from his home area back in Norway. Once he gets there, he meets Julia Olson. They fall in love and get married. Julia was born in the United States, but her parents came from the very same community that Eric came from. Eric was not very well educated. I think he had 4 years of elementary school. But he was bright, self-taught, very well read. I understand when he came to America, he was already fluent in 5 languages. Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, of course, but also German and English. Well, he was an industrious young guy, so the Rock Island Railroad hired him and asked him immediately to go south to Rock Rapids, Iowa, to take over supervision of track maintenance in the general area. They go down there. He buys a couple adjacent lots, builds a very nice house for those days on it, and does okay. Their youngest daughter was Esther, and she's my mom, or was my mom. So again, like the Germans, this kind of story for the Norwegians was replicated over and over and over again in this area, and we have a lot of Scandinavians, in particular Norwegians, but a substantial number of Swedes as well. Okay, now the third group I want to talk about are the Dutch. Their story is a little bit different. We know that a number of Dutch came over during our colonial period. After all, they founded New Amsterdam, and they colonized or populated the lower Hudson Valley all the way up to Albany. I want to talk about the ones that came during the 19th century. Now, most of those folks ended up going to southwestern Michigan, the Grand Rapids area. One of the communities they got going was Holland, Michigan. You probably heard of it. The Dutch were a little bit different because they had a very, very strong sense of community, I think engendered mainly by the influence of their church. And so as they grew up, they didn't want to move away. They wanted to stay locally. But that was an agrarian society back in those days, at least in that part of the country. And so they soon ran out of enough land to support everybody who wanted to have a farm. So it got to be a big problem. So they did a very Dutchy thing. In 1847, they formed a formal migration. And they went west. This migration went west to central Iowa. And that's where we get Pella from. And we know that up to this time, Pella is a very much Dutch kind of community. Well, history kind of repeats itself. And pretty soon we have too many Dutch in Pella. And so they once again form another migration, and they head up to northwest Iowa to what is called Sioux County, which is just below Lyon County. And the first community they establish is Orange City. They named Orange City in honor of the royal color or the national color of the Netherlands. And that was the national color ever since the days of William and Mary of orange. Now, these Dutch, because of their church, Dutch Reformed Church, were not allowed to dance, not even square dancing, or to play cards, or all kinds of recreational activities. So what did they do? They had babies. And they had a lot of them. And it didn't take long for them to fill up Sioux County. You had communities like Hayward and the Rock Valley and Sioux Center and Hull and Boyden, names that you probably have heard of. But they were so good at having babies. The population growth was not restrained just to Sioux County. A number of them went a little bit further north, up into Lyon County. So I had a number of classmates with Dutch names, like De Boer, Van Hove, Wiarde, Wissink, Akengay, among others. So we had a lot of Dutch people there. It didn't take long before the Dutch really established a great reputation as farmers. The land was super good, but they were especially expert at farming, and they were famous for the very neatness and well-managed farmsteads that they had. Now, the fourth and final group I want to talk about are those people who came over from the UK. We got a few Welsh, not many, and a few Scots, again, not many, but a large number of English and a reasonable number of Irish that came during this time period into Siouxland. Now, one community I can talk about was up the very, very northwest corner of the state, 2 miles from Minnesota, 2 miles from South Dakota. But this group of Englishmen and women brought with them seedlings of the larch tree, which they successfully planted. I don't know how they pulled it off, but they did. But they wanted this memory of their home country. And so we call this town Larchwood. And it's up there in the corner. It's basically nowadays a bedroom community for Sioux Falls, and it has a really flourishing casino operation going. Now, another English town in this area you've heard of, I'm sure, Lamars. Lamars is in Plymouth County, which you go Lyon County, straight south to Sioux County, then Plymouth County is the next county. Just below that's Woodbury County, where Sioux City is. Okay, but several Englishmen came over to Plymouth County and they buy up a lot of land. Then they go back to England and start a real estate venture. And their target was the nobility. Now, if you're a nobleman, when you die, your eldest son gets your title, your land, and your mansion. But if you have more sons, you have a problem. Well, usually one of those sons might go into the church. But don't go in as a priest, you go in at least as a bishop. And then some would go to the military. If you go to the military, you'll probably get some training at Sandhurst, but when you complete that training, you buy your commission. And you don't buy it to be a lieutenant. You buy it to be at least a major, more likely a colonel. But what happens if you have even more sons? Or if you have sons that don't want to go to the church or the military? So that was their target. So they pretty much advertised, buy some really great farmland from us in Plymouth County, state of Iowa, US of A, and you can replicate your lifestyle. So a number of them did just that. They came over, they bought their land, they built their mansion houses. The little town of Lamars was established to serve their needs. The name Lamars was simply a made-up name. It sounded classy. It was a marketing decision. But for a while, it was working out fairly well. The that group of people were kind of famous in the area for the fancy balls they had, and they even had a polo team. Now, there were no other polo teams in the area to play, so most of their matches had to be intra-squad affairs. But we do have a record that on 2 occasions, a polo team went from Mars down to St. Louis and played a series of matches down there. But even though they got off to a fairly good start, it was not sustainable. They were bringing poor English people over as indentured servants to work for them. But it got harder and harder to get enough people to do that for them. And a lot of the ones that did, after a little short time, they would realize, some night here, we could just run away. Head west into Nebraska. They'll never find us, and we can get some free homestead land and make a much better life for ourselves. So the whole enterprise sort of fell apart, and most of the Englishmen returned home to England. And today we know Lamar's mainly for Blue Bunny ice cream. So these are the four main groups of people who move into what we call Siouxland. Now, if you go to the two urban centers, Sioux City and Sioux Falls, you have people from all over. You have black African Americans, you have indigenous people, Indians from the South Dakota reservations, and you have people from all over. But even with that, Sioux City and Sioux Falls have a higher percentage of people from Northwest Iowa than almost any other cities in the United States. And if you go to the more rural parts of Siouxland, just about everybody is from the Netherlands or Germany or Norway or Sweden or the UK. So what we have, therefore, is a very area that's quite homogeneous in this population, more so than most areas of our country. Now, what does this mean? Why does it matter that that's what the population is? I can tell you about at least three outcomes or impacts. First is, this is one of the most conservative political areas in the country. This is rock-ribbed Republican territory. Very few Republicans run opposed in local elections. If you get the Republican nomination, it's all wrapped up. Now, why is this? Why is the 4th Congressional District of Iowa more conservative than the other 3 districts? Well, when the ancestors of the current residents of Siouxland moved in, they had all this very valuable farmland free or inexpensively available to them. Now, so they got farms going. Now, farming in those days was very, very hard work. But you could do okay. And you could gradually really build up a nice farm and have a good lifestyle for you and your family. Or there were also a number of commercial opportunities in the small towns that sprung up to serve these farmers, like Rock Rapids and Orange City and Lamar's. And so, right from the very beginning, these people had this attitude: we can do it on our own. We don't need the government to help us. We don't need government interference. And so they had this very strong conservative attitude. They didn't have to go through some of the problems that inner city people in big cities have. That just didn't occur there to speak of. Not a lot of really rich people, but hardly any poor people in that area. Another influence for that was the church. About 100% of the Dutch were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. And this, again, is a very conservative church, based pretty much on the teachings of John Calvin, one of the great theologians of the Reformation. And so that religious influence impacts their political outlook as well. And then most of the Germans came from North Germany, and the Scandinavians that moved into that area were members of the Lutheran Church. And the Lutheran synods that dominated in that area back in that day were very conservative, like the Wisconsin Synod, the Missouri Synod. And so I think that had a big influence as well. So this becomes a very conservative area, remains so to this day. A second impact is height. Siouxlanders are taller than most Americans on average. Again, why is this? Probably because from a fairly narrow genetic pool, pretty much northwestern Europe. Back in Europe, the Dutch are the tallest people in Europe. Very definitely so. Second to them are the Scandinavians. And remember, the Germans that came over to Siouxland were more from the north than the south. And North Germans are taller than South Germans. So we have tall people up there. I can give you some examples. When I was in high school, I played on the high school basketball team, and I can remember one game in particular was a bedlam game. It was between Rock Rapids and Rock Valley down there from Sioux County. And it was just amazing. People could not get into the gym. It was just packed. And it was so loud. But as I walked out onto the court for the tip-off, I looked around. And of the other 9 players, 5 of them were at least 2 inches taller than me. So now, Rock Rapids and Rock Valley were small schools. So that was pretty amazingly bunch of tall guys from the 1950s from such small towns. And by the way, on the side, those very 2 schools are playing each other, I think tomorrow, I think, for the Iowa State Championship in 2A. So they're 2 towns 12 miles apart, way up there in the corner, and they're playing down here. So go Lions. Okay. Now, with tallness or height comes big feet, or at least long feet. When Flo and I lived out in Long Island, I went to many shoe stores. Never once found a pair of shoes in my size in stock. I had to go to a place called the Smithtown Bootery, where it was owned and operated by a fellow who had kids in my school. And we would sit down and look through a catalog or 2, and I'd pick out the shoes I wanted, and he'd get them for me. One time I came back to visit my parents, and I was in Sioux Falls, that's where I flew into, and I was some time there. So I went over to my favorite men's clothing store, Weather Waxes, and I headed right to the shoe department. And I told the clerk who greeted me what I wanted. And after he measured my feet, he goes away. And a couple minutes later, he comes back with 7 or 8 boxes of shoes. And he said, I think we have exactly what you want here. But if you don't find something, I've got more. And I don't remember what color I wanted. It was brown or black, but I wanted it in my size. And that was amazing. So at least when it comes to shoe stores, there's a big difference between Long Island, New York, and Siouxland. Now, a third outcome is longevity. Siouxlanders live longer. Again, probably because of that relatively narrow genetic pool they come from, but also they probably generally lived a more healthy lifestyle up until fairly recently, which is not true anymore, I don't think. But we have people living a long time. About 20 years ago, there was a study of longevity in the United States, county by county, and there's thousands of counties in the United States. Now, I read an article that came out of that study, which listed the 20 counties with the best longevity. And 2 of those 20 counties are in Iowa. In fact, they're in Siouxland. In fact, they are Lyon County and Sioux County. So people maybe just are stubborn, I don't know, but they tend to live a little bit longer in that area. So if you're from Siouxland, you're probably white, tall, long-lived, and conservative. And I kind of fit at least 3 of those. So anyway, that's my report on my homeland. And thank you for being so patient while I rambled on for over half an hour. So I think I probably... Any counter comments?
Dave, do they still have the tendency toward being tall in that area?
Yeah. Now, the population has stayed pretty homogeneous, and there's a lot of tall people. I suppose those 2 basketball teams that are going to be playing each other aren't very short.
Yeah, we get to it and see. Anyone have a question they'd like to pose to Dave?
I have a mic. You got it, Bill?
Yep.
I got one
You
too.
got one? Okay.
Yeah. Here, let's talk for the people.
Are there any Russian Germans in this area?
Probably, but there'll be darn few. There are not many Jewish. Well, in Sioux City and Sioux Falls, of course, there are synagogues. I don't know of any. My last year at college, Flo was had graduated ahead of me, and she took a job in Sibley, which is in this area, and I became close friends with a Jewish couple. They had a couple kids. Great, interesting family. The father was a an Austrian Jew from Vienna, and he married an American woman who was from the deep south and redheaded and really a Southern belle.
Stop. I'm not asking about Jewish people.
Oh.
I'm asking about Russian Germans who came to this country.
Well,
I think a lot of them settled in North Dakota.
Yes.
I don't know about Siouxland.
Yeah, well, there would be a fair number. Most of the Germans that came into Siouxland were from Germany, not so much from other countries like Russia.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, not too many at all. It's interesting, in our town, we had a lot of different churches, but we had one Catholic church. Back in those days, there was a fair amount of religious discrimination. But I remember as a little boy hearing people say, well, our Catholics are okay. They're German Catholics. They're not Irish or Polish or Russian, whatever. Okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much.